You've heard it said before, autism is a superpower, but is it really? Today we'll chat about the well meaning but potentially harmful notion of autism being viewed as a superpower and why this opinion may vary among autistic individuals. Before we get started, don't forget to like, share, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for reminders of upcoming streams. Let's get started. Hi, Embracers!
Welcome back.
So, this topic is very similar, I think, to the topic of last week, but slightly different. We talked about high functioning autism, but there's some people that take that to an extreme of superpowers.
Right. And I mean, we have Hollywood and other shows and things that kind of steer us in that direction. So kind of coming back to reality a little bit and kind of putting a normal stance on it rather than super abilities of sorts.
Something hyperbolic.
Right.
Yeah. So, again, to start off with a disclaimer, I want to say that there are autistic individuals that do have what you could consider a superpower. So, there are the ones that are super great at math or eidetic memory or whatever it may be. And there are actually people who can do these things. So, it does exist, it is a thing. However, the reason that we're bringing this up and we're talking about how this can be potentially harmful is because there also seems to be a prevalence of that representation of autism in Hollywood and media. And because of that, it seems like society and the social understanding of autism tends to fall more on that rather than the reality of most people's cases of autism, which normally doesn't have any sort of like quote unquote superpower.
And I don't really like, as much as we like to blame like Hollywood and like they're, I mean, they're in the business of trying to make things exciting and like all that. Like, I mean, we think of so many movies where it's like a person, an everyday person, and they have like an exciting life. And it's like, in reality, it's like, oh, okay, they might not have a super exciting job in like reality. So, I mean, yeah, like I understand like Hollywood is trying to like create a situation that is sometimes a little far fetched from like what actually is the reality, but that's Hollywood.
Yeah. I mean, again, we can't really blame them for that because you want a movie or show that is entertaining or exciting. So I get
Right.
the idea. But there have been other people who have attempted to make like movies and TV shows about autism that have made it a little bit more realistic. There's not a whole lot of them, but they're out there. One of the shows is like Love on the Spectrum, for example. Like that one gives you a more realistic view on autism rather than something like Rain Man, for example. That's the one that's always referred to, which is funny because we still haven't seen it. We,
Right.
we need to see it.
We need to do a viewing party or something just to get that
Yeah.
one seen and then we can relate to it more.
But autism as a superpower, what does that actually mean? So, from my understanding, what people tend to mean when they say autism is a superpower, oftentimes I've seen them use it as a way of trying to make a parent feel better about an autism diagnosis of their child. So, I know for us, when we had our daughter first diagnosed, the first one, she was like barely 2 years old, basically, when she was diagnosed. And I remember going back to see my doctor, and I brought her along with me. And as well meaning and well intentioned as she was, because she was a really sweet doctor that we really got along with, she essentially responded by saying, when we told her that our child was autistic, by saying that, oh, that's fine. She's going to be super smart. She's going to be able to do this. She's going to be able to do that. And it was just like rattling a list of all these like autism stereotypes. And at the time, we did not know what the situation would be for our daughter because at that time she was completely nonverbal, non-responsive. So there was a very real possibility that she would, for example, never learn to talk at that point. And I found it very concerning that society kind of jumps to this conclusion of like, oh, they're autistic, that's fine. They're going to be a genius and great at all these things because a parent might be told that and then let down later down the road when they end up having the child who never speaks.
Yeah, I mean, it can definitely be, I mean, in that situation, that was a kind of, I want to say like almost like dangerous, like piece of advice or not even advice, but just like statement because like it could be getting your like hopes up like, oh wow, okay, I thought things were going to be difficult, but you're telling me like my child is going to be like a super genius and there's never going to be any challenges along the way. Like, wow, who would have gotten such lucky news or whatever? And it's not the case. So I mean, like, I feel like that could be like a very dangerous like statement to be like tossing around to someone who just finds out about a diagnosis, because I mean there are certainly are challenges. I mean, um we just I mean just the other day, as far as like kids putting things in their mouth, having to work through like feeding therapy to try and work on like being able to eat foods. I mean, some of the food restrictions alone, and I mean that's just focusing on a very narrow margin about just trying to eat food. So I mean there are definitely some challenges along the way, so I feel like probably not the best advice that could have been, given possibly, but, like, I understand that they were trying to come from, like, a place, like, trying not to, like, worry you essentially, because we didn't really know much about autism at the time, so I feel like in a way it was trying to be like a, like, comfort, like, "Oh, don't worry, like, everything's gonna be okay," but in doing so, it kind of danced on some potentially challenging areas.
Yeah, I do think that it was well intentioned. I think the problem with that, though, is sometimes if you're too optimistic about things, you are ill prepared for reality. And that's why, for me personally, I self describe as a realist. So I don't consider myself an optimist or a pessimist. I consider myself a realist, which to me means I am trying to figure out what is the most likely possibility or most likely outcome, and that's the one that I'm going to try to build the future on, which is ironic because in a previous episode I was talking about how when I get in those moments of anxiety, then I think worst case scenario. But when I am, not stressed out, my baseline is to be more of a realist. And because of that, I can prepare better for these circumstances. So if my child has an autism diagnosis, I'm like, okay, what could this possibly mean? It means it's possible that she may never speak, but it means it's possible that she may. So I'm going to kind of teeter on the middle here and plan for the worst. So I'm going to plan for the therapies. I'm going to plan for going intensive at home with maybe reading therapy or putting on like speech therapy videos on YouTube, things like that. But I'm not going to assume that this is going to resolve the speech problem. I'm just going to keep working at it with the hope that it will, but not the assumption that it will. And that is kind of what has helped me stay in a mentally, quote unquote, safe space, essentially, where I don't feel too disappointed if the outcome isn't what I'm hoping for. But at the same time, I am not completely giving up and therefore losing potential progress.
Right, but you wanna know something interesting with all that you just said?
What?
So, I mean, well, okay, so I mean, you are autistic, but do you think in your analysis of all of that, being a realist could in fact be like part of like your autism, like kind of
100%.
well, I
I
was gonna say
think the
because
reason I do that is because I'm autistic and I think of things in like solving logical puzzles.
perfect, you got okay, that's exactly what I was going for. So, I mean, like, because I'm wondering if that is part of like your like autism superpower of sorts, as far as like the logical reasoning, intense like focus in a key area, like when you need to. So I wonder if those are kind of like filtered in through like your, I guess, perception of the world a little bit based on your autism, essentially. So in a weird way, your
Yeah.
autism diagnosis might be like the logical reasoning, as well as kind of the intense focus in these categories as you kind of laid out right there.
Yeah, and that's why I also wanted to talk about how this opinion on whether or not autism is a superpower varies among autistic individuals, because there are situations and circumstances where an autistic person might actually view an aspect of themselves as a superpower. So, like our oldest, again, she taught herself to read. I would consider that to be like an autistic superpower, quote unquote, because who else could teach themselves to read at 2 years old? That's super unlikely. So that is something that is a plus that did come from her autism. And for me personally, I have kind a couple. I would say like what Matt was discussing, but I also have this talent, I guess, where I've always been able to write in-depth essays or last minute speeches or things like that very eloquently at the last minute with very little notice. And ironically, it doesn't translate to my speaking. My speaking, I stumble more and I have to process more. But when it comes to writing, I am very good at whipping up like a 20-page essay in like a day or two. I think my thesis for my master's I did in 1 week, whereas most people had to do it in 2 semesters, and I finished it in 1 week.
Right. That is the intense focus that we were talking about earlier. So, like, I think, I mean, for me, a little bit, I think sometimes, like, the focus of like superpower, like, it can be different things, not just like, oh, they have to be amazing at math or like super reader or super memory thing. I think there's a lot of different categories that if you kind of reflect on them, they could be kind of exceptional in a way. Like I would say like one is like honesty, for example. Like I view like that potentially as like could be like a superpower. Like I was talking to a woman at like our therapy and she was mentioning like how her son would he got a job and his job was 9 to 5 and he would clock in every day at exactly 9 o'clock and then he would take exactly a 20-minute break for lunch and exactly clock out at 5 o'clock. And I'm like, I feel like your neurotypical person is kind of like, well, okay, I'm at 9 o'clock. If I take like a 35-minute lunch, like no harm, no, but like she was kind of explaining like his day routine. And I was like, wow, that's kind of phenomenal that he's analyzing it with such precision that it's kind of like a super like honesty power that like everyday people are just kind of like, okay, like it's a job and that's kind of that.
But that can also be a negative, and the reason I say that
Well,
is because
that's
that
true.
was also one of my superpowers, quote unquote, is that I was very honest, and I did the exact same thing when I was working my jobs, clocking in exactly at that time, clocking out at the exact time that I was supposed to. But that also came with the negatives of you're really honest with people when they ask for your opinion, and sometimes the honest truth of the opinion is not what they actually want to hear, so that can backfire, which is why, again, some of these things seem like a superpower on the outside, but can actually end up harming the individual and their social relationships. The other one was I actually was able to. This one kind of cracks me up a bit, but I was able to navigate relationships and people. If that, I'm trying to put it euphemistically, it's another word for manipulating, manipulating people. So I
Cool.
was able to like manipulate people. And so like whenever I was like young and I was seeking relationships like boyfriends or things like that, because of my power to like observe human behavior, I could observe a lot of what people were doing, why they were doing it, what the outcome was. So I would be like, okay, every time he does this, the girl does that. Every time she does this, the guy does that. And from observation, I was able to assess patterns of behavior. So I was able to learn like, okay, what can I do to make a guy want to date me? And I was able to successfully figure out how to play that like cat and mouse game, and I was able to get a ton of guys who would play cat, and I played mouse. And I know that that's, not what my husband wants to hear.
I'm more of a dog person, really. So
Yeah, you were different, a different game. But
there we go.
but I was able to do that through the power of observation. I was able to just sit there and kind of perceive from like an outside perspective, like if I was watching a TV show and observe the pattern of behavior and then be like, "Okay, I'm going to replicate that because that's the outcome that I want." And that did serve me well in many instances. But again, for every superpower, there's a super negative. And the downside of that is that sometimes I would use those scripts and they wouldn't work. And then because they wouldn't work, I would get kind of stuck and not know what else to try because I was using a script. Whereas people who are neurotypical and not using that sort of script can navigate those with more flexibility. They can switch the conversation, they can change up their body language and, like, adapt to the other person. And that was something I have always struggled with.
And that's where, I mean, you touched on, I mean, with the honesty, I mean, a little bit as well with this, as far as like the observation. So you do raise a good point, like having like these quote unquote superpowers, that doesn't guarantee like no problems whatsoever. I mean, because honestly, you're right. If you are too honest, then it has the other negative consequence where people are you're struggling with people as far as interactions because they might accept a white lie better than they would the honest truth. And I mean, I think of like a superhero movie, like they constantly have problems with like their superpowers. Like it's not all like all powerful. Oh, I'm a superhero. That means smooth sailing all ahead. You can have a superpower and still struggle with that superpower. It's just a ability that your typical person wouldn't necessarily possess. And I mean, and it's not just, I mean, along those, I mean, like you mentioned as far as like creativity, I think creativity is, I mean, a phenomenal one as far as being able to write stories and come up with like these alternate realities at the drop of a hat. I mean, some people can do that, but I mean, your typical everyday person. I mean, I certainly have very, very little creativity when it comes to that. So, I mean, like, I consider that to be a superpower because it is something that not everyone has or that comes as easily to them.
Yeah, and one of the things that I have found interesting in the conversations that I've had with the IRL podcast series, where I've been interviewing different people in the autism community, I've had lots of conversations with autistic adults, and it seems like a complete mixed bag of responses when it comes to viewing autism as a superpower. So there's a lot of people who feel like, oh, it is a superpower because I feel empowered by my ability to do X, Y, and Z as an autistic individual. But then there's lots of people who see it as more harmful, and they get kind of offended by the idea of people perceiving autism as a superpower because to them, it feels more like a deficit, it feels more like a disability, and it feels like something that's constantly getting in the way of success in life or hindering them in one way or another. I personally am somewhere in the middle where I definitely feel like my autism and my children's autism is definitely disabling. It's definitely put roadblocks in all of our lives in one way or another. However, I have also seen good things coming out of our autism because we all have some sort of ability that is more in tune to, I guess, a higher level of thinking or whatever you might want to call it than it is for a neurotypical person. So I have certain skills that the average person doesn't have, like being able to whip up a 20-page essay in like a day, or actually less. It was like an hour drive to school. And other people have the ability to do things like that one guy that was in the news years ago that he got on a helicopter. He was autistic. He got up on a helicopter flight and they had him survey the sky. What's it called? The
The
cityscape,
skyline of New York City
skyline or
for
cityscape.
for like 20 minutes or something.
Yeah, they just flew him around and he didn't have anything on him at the time. He just his eyeballs basically gazing around. And then they brought him down and then they said, okay, go ahead and draw what you saw. And he was able to recreate in very detailed a drawing that showed the entire cityscape with all the high risers and everything in very
And I think it
specific
was like a
detail.
panoramic, like basically like an entire wall, like panoramic view of like the skyline, which I mean, obviously, I mean, it looked fantastic. I mean, it was crazy. I mean, yeah, I don't know many people alive that could possibly do that. I mean, and I mean, there's numerous stories where there are cases. There used to be a TV show years ago called, I think, like Superhumans, and they had a autistic individual on there who was really good with music, and he was able to, listening to one run through of like a composition, I think in jazz, and they picked jazz because it was very complex. He was able to recreate with like a 97% accuracy just listening to it once and then replaying it on the piano. So I mean, there are like these phenomenal like stories that you hear, but they tend to, I think, focus, I mean, in some categories on like the superhuman ability component versus like some of the other challenges that they would have. So I mean, and kind of I mean, we see it I mean, honestly, like with you, with our daughters, and I'm sure with them as well, where they're not able to turn off their mind as easily as like a neurotypical. Like I can basically like fall asleep at night to like in like 5 seconds. Like I basically just pass out. Probably not good, probably not a good thing. But but as far as like our daughter, like I mean, she will be looking on the monitor and she'll be up sometimes 1, 2, 3 in the morning, and she'll be drawing, and we know that, okay, she's having a hard time kind of quieting her mind, and she has to, like, keep going. And I mean, that's just one specific challenge that, okay, she taught herself to read and like, wow, it can be good with math as well. But the downside is she's not really able to like quiet her mind and like settle down. And I'm sure that from a struggle, I mean, I'm sure that's very challenging and difficult when all you might want to do is just sleep because after a long day you're tired.
Yeah, that is, like, super relatable because you know me, I have insomnia because I'm up all night and my brain is just going a million miles an hour, like, I cannot quiet it because I'm constantly thinking of a million different things, and usually it's me coming up with solutions to certain things. So that's definitely something that I see as, like, a negative is even though you might have all these bright ideas or you are able to learn and catch on to things quickly or whatever it may be, there are consequences to that neurologically. So I'm gonna throw a teeny tiny bit of neuroscience nerdiness out there because again, that was my background. I was an EG tech. I just nerded out on this stuff all the time growing up. But one of the things that I learned about in neuroscience is about neuroplasticity, which is basically the flexibility of your neurons in your brain to make new connections or basically move their connections around. So the neurons in your brain is basically the parts that control every part of your brain, you know, wherever you store empathy, hunger, everything. And what happens is that your neurons are not always like solid, like they don't just stay and be like, okay, I'm a taste neuron, I'm going to be a taste neuron forever. There have been lots of studies that show that when people have like brain injuries or autism or any other sort of brain or neurological issue, sometimes what the neurons will do is they will kind of adapt by changing what they do to accommodate for that. And one of the theories behind autism has been that some parts of the brain that have essentially, I'm trying to think of a non-scientific way of saying this, but essentially some parts of the brain have taken on additional roles that that brain part normally does not. And that's how you start getting these abilities. So maybe the part of your brain that processes music or math, that part of the brain, the neurons have kind of taken more over from the area that's right next to it. And so whatever area is right next to it will then, as a consequence, experience more of a deficit. So that's what happens is like we don't have an indefinite amount of neurological connections in our brain. We can't just continuously be smart at everything all at once. There has to be something taken away from somewhere in order to do that. And that's why whenever you see a kid or an adult who's autistic who has very high level of skill in one area, you see what they call that spiky profile, which means they have a deficit in another area. It's kind of to compensate for that spike.
And I can't remember and I can't remember which kid it was, but when one of our daughters was younger, I thought that they was kind of like a blending of some of the skills. So I can't remember if she was like listening to music, but was telling us colors that were sequenced with the music or
Oh, yeah.
something along that. And I think she was only like 3 at the time, but
That
she
was
was
our
able.
older one.
I couldn't remember which one it was, but she was like associating like the colors with different types of music and like the repetition. And she's very good with the music parts. I don't know music, so, like, the yeah, I don't know how to
Notes?
well, like, you know how, like, she'll, like, listen to a song and she'll be like, "Oh, this is this song, but it's been modified in a different key,"
Oh,
and it
yeah, like, she's able to tell you what key it's in, what chord, whether it's a harmony or a melody.
and
Yeah.
then yeah, like, different, like, styles of, like, music and how it's been manipulated, and then we're, like, listening to it and we're like, "Oh, yeah, I guess you're right." So, I mean, she had, like, I think, like, 3, she was saying that, like, she was able to, like, see colors with, like, the music that she was listening to. So, I mean, I'm not sure if that in particular is kind of like the blending of, like, different parts of the mind, but it's just kind of a interesting perspective from, like, a dad's perspective who has none of that super knowledge or skills.
Yeah, I think that the interesting part for me is that with every autistic person, you see very different things. And I do find that fascinating and interesting because although we do have our weaknesses, we do have our strengths. And the one thing I do want to call out again is that not every autistic person has what would be considered a superpower. So there are the more severe autistic individuals who can't care for themselves, can't eat, can't speak, can't do many things. And so those individuals oftentimes are lumped in with the ones that quote unquote do have a superpower. And that can cause some issues because there's oversight when it comes to how to navigate those autism diagnoses. So if a mother says my child is autistic and maybe they're a level 3 autistic, it's not helpful if you're like, "Oh, don't worry, they'll be really great at math," or "They might be amazing," or "It'll be great to see what superpower they get." Like, something like that, I find, can easily be offensive to a parent or a caretaker because there's no guarantee that there will be any superpower, and might it might kinda devastate you a little bit because it might get your hopes up and also give people this false notion of what autism really is.
Right, and that's why, I mean, honestly, I think why, like, outreach is kind of, like, important, and I mean, honestly, like, I understand, like, Hollywood's, like, game as far as making exciting movies, but if they also offset it sometimes and kind of gave more of a reality, kind of like, Love on the Spectrum, or even, I think we had watched was it Atypical, where it kind of went into some of
Yeah.
the challenges and such there. So if they gave more shows that were more honest and kind of truthful about kind of like the ups and the downs, some of the challenges on the everyday and things like that, just to put it in a better perspective where it kind of spreads more awareness. So more individuals are kind of on the same page as far as like what is autism as a whole, rather than just, oh, I heard about this once and this is what it is or what I perceive it to be.
Yeah. And the other thing to consider is changing your mindset a little bit around why we're calling it a superpower. So I always like to reflect on, like, okay, why do people say this? What is the intent behind telling somebody, hey, your child has a superpower or autism is a superpower, which you see tons of charities do and it always kind of grinds my gears a bit. But the reason I say to think about the why is because oftentimes there is a positive intent there, and it might be to try to spread more awareness or acceptance. It might be because you're trying to support the other person. Like maybe they're upset because their child got an autism diagnosis and you're trying to help them feel better. Whatever that end goal is, I would try to figure that out and then see if there's another way that you can achieve that goal. So, if you're just trying to cheer someone up, perhaps consider sharing why having an autism diagnosis is more acceptable than it used to be, essentially. Like, it's not the end of the world if your child has an autism diagnosis. And these are some positive things that could come out of that in the future if you work towards it, etc., providing resources, guidance, that sort of thing, rather than submitting some sort of unrealistic expectation that your child is gonna suddenly have some sort of superpower.
Right. I mean, because it kinda keeps it more grounded as well, because, like, yeah, you can kind of float the idea of like, "Oh, yeah, they're gonna be like a brain like, they're gonna be a brain surgeon or, I don't know, rocket scientist or whatever the heck that you wanna toss at them." But, I mean, as far as giving the actual, like, there have been huge improvements as far as, like, the different like, even the different therapies. I mean, now, I mean, as far as, like, even, like, play therapy being kind of introduced more and um, just more opportunities to try and work through some of the challenges that they have. Like, I mean, I think um, back in like what, like the 80s or so, it was basically kind of shunned. And I mean, even before that, and I mean, just terrible things happened to individuals who were diagnosed with autism at the time. And now it's definitely a new world. And now there are so many more resources and therapies that you can kind of start to work with and kind of make improvements on the day-to-day living. That, I mean, I think it's great that they're continuously pushing and improving upon those, so there's more resources out there.
Yeah, so this one's kind of like a mixed bag. I'm wondering what you guys think. Do you all think that autism is a superpower? If so, what superpower do you feel that you or your autistic child have? And if not, does it impact you when others refer to autism as a superpower? Is it something that ends up actually hurting your family or your child? Let us know in the comments on YouTube or Facebook at Autism Wish, or by continuing the conversation with us in our private Embracing Autism community. Don't forget to become a member by visiting autismwish.org, and you'll get exclusive access to us and some awesome resources that we've included in there. Thanks for hanging out with us, everyone, and we will see y'all next time.
All right. Bye.
Bye.